Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you for the introduction. And actually, prior to founding Fashion Revolution, I worked for the previous 23 years working and building up my own brand, Pachacuti, which is the world's only fair trade Panama hat specialist. So when we were talking earlier this morning about some of the complexities of working with fair trade, with small producers, with remote rural communities, believe me, I know all about it. And after 23 years, I have to say it still doesn't get that much easier. But it is an incredibly rewarding way to work. And actually, just to put some context in this, Pachacuti was the first brand in the world to be fair trade certified by the World Fair Trade Organization. And one of the pioneering projects we worked on was the EU Geo Fair Trade project. And this set about trying to give sustainable provenance for raw materials and for products. And most of the products covered in the project were commodities like coffee, vanilla, and Pachacuti's Panama hats was the only actual sort of composite product. And we traced our Panama hats back not just to the GPS coordinates of every weaver's house, but back to the raw materials, the parcels of land where the producers were growing the straw for our hats. So that gives you a little bit of context in terms of the importance of transparency, which I'm going to be talking about today, but also some of my business history before founding Fashion Revolution. So, can green become the new black? I've been asked to talk about this topic today, and I think the question can really be interpreted in two different ways. When addressed to brands, we're asking, can green become the future of fashion? Can the mainstream industry become more environmentally responsible, more socially responsible? And what needs to happen what needs to be done differently to make this happen at scale? We've talked today a lot about the importance of small brands, of shopping sustainably, of encouraging those small ethical designers. But for real change to happen at Fashion Revolution, I believe that it's the mainstream that has to change. We have to put pressure on the big brands, on fast fashion and on luxury. And when this question is addressed to consumers, the question is, can we mainstream ways to consume differently, perhaps to consume less, to consume more sustainably, to participate in the sharing economy? And I believe that for green to become the new black, that both approaches are needed. So at Fashion Revolution, we believe that for a revolution to happen in the fashion industry, it has to entail change by the mainstream brands. It's not just cheap, fast fashion. Mass-produced luxury is equally to blame, and it's often made on exactly the same production lines. And that change has to start now. We've been using a Greenpeace statistic you can see here in the corner for the last few years, which is from a 2012 report saying that 80 billion new garments were delivered out of factories every year. Now that figure, as Kate mentioned earlier, has increased to 150 billion. That's in just 4 years. That's equivalent to 20 new items of clothing for every person on the planet every year. And I can tell you, when I talk to the weaving communities I work with in Ecuador, not one of those people buys a single new item of clothing. So that's obviously a lot of people buying at least double their allocation of new items of clothing every year. And the impact of all of this fashion consumption is well documented. I'm not going to repeat it all here. But for those who want to know the facts about why we need to green the fashion industry, the information is readily available. There's a lot of information available on our website with links to other organisations. But let's just take water as one instance. The Aral Sea was once the 4th largest lake in the world. It was surrounded by fishing communities and home to millions of fish and sea life. Figure A shows the Aral Sea in the 1970s, and figure F shows it now. It covers only 10% of its former area. Why? Demand for cotton in Uzbekistan, one of the world's leading cotton producers. And when we talk about green, we need to consider the social as much as the environmental. That same cotton which has depleted the Aral Sea in Uzbekistan is harvested using forced labour. Over 1 million people every year are forced to leave their homes, leave their work and go out into the fields to harvest the cotton crop. Until recently, very recently, that harvest was carried out using child labour as well. The children had to give up schooling over around 3 months every summer. And this cotton is routinely labelled made in Bangladesh. Nobody wants cotton from Uzbekistan. It was also widely reported this year that Islamic State have taken over 3/4 of the cotton fields in Syria. So how do we as consumers, when brands don't know where their raw materials come from, how do we know that we're not supporting either forced labour, slave labour or terrorism with the next cotton garment which we buy? Since Fashion Revolution was formed in 2013, we've focused on transparency in the supply chain, asking the question, who made my clothes? And this goes all the way back to who picked the cotton, because we believe that transparency is a prerequisite in improving conditions. You can't start to tackle social or environmental exploitation unless you can see it. Since the Rana Plaza disaster, words like transparency, truth and authenticity in the fashion supply chain have started to become industry buzzwords. Fashion brands, big and small, are starting to talk about their sourcing, their provenance, the craftsmanship of their clothing and accessories. I opened Harper's Bazaar this month and there was an advert, I think it was for Chanel, with a beautiful bag on one side and a photograph of the artisan in Italy who made the bag on the other side. Is this just greenwashing? Is it the marketing and PR teams of corporate and small brands alike who are trying to put a positive spin on some of the ugliness which permeates the industry? Or is it an indication of a real shift towards green becoming more mainstream? I think the answer is probably a little bit of both. The legendary creative director Alex Bogusky said, "Transparency is not a choice. The only choice is, does it happen to you or do you participate in it?" Transparency is becoming obligatory. It's coming at companies whether they like it or not. So it really makes sense for them to get ahead of the curve. Government regulations around the world are becoming more stringent. We saw the California Transparency Act coming into law in 2012 and the UK's Modern Slavery Act coming into force this year, which forces brands to take responsibility for slavery throughout their supply chain. They have to report on this every year. And then, of course, there's a continued pressure from stakeholders, from shareholders, from NGOs, from environmental groups like Greenpeace with their Detox the Catwalk report. In April this year, Fashion Revolution published the first edition of the Fashion Transparency Index. We scored 40 of the world's largest fashion companies on what information they choose to disclose to their stakeholders and the public about social and environmental issues across their supply chains. We found that only 5 of the companies published their first-tier factories, and only H&M and Adidas published their second-tier suppliers. This is the fabric and yarn mills or their subcontractors. Almost half of the brands had little or nothing in place to track where their raw materials came from, let alone making this information public. Surprisingly, a massive 25% showed little or no evidence of monitoring labour issues at all in their supply chain. And one of the most interesting findings for me was that only 26% of companies showed evidence of working on the ground with trade unions, civil society, with NGOs in the supplier countries to start to improve working conditions. And hardly any of the luxury brands we surveyed were involved in multi-stakeholder initiatives like the Ethical Trading Initiative, Better Work, or the Greenpeace Detox campaign. And this is really important because no brand, even the very best of brands, is going to change the industry on its own. Because if you take a factory by factory approach, you're never going to solve the systemic problems facing the industry. Brands need to engage with trade unions, with NGOs on the ground, with civil society, with multi-stakeholder initiatives, to ensure that workers have a right to negotiate a decent wage which they can live on. One of the exciting projects Fashion Revolution is working on over the coming year is the biggest ever survey of what constitutes a living wage for a garment worker, with 540 workers keeping a daily record of their income and expenditure in India, Bangladesh and Cambodia. And in over 90% of garment factories around the world, workers have no right to bargain collectively with their employer over wages. So we clearly have a very long way to go. It's also really important to recognise at this stage that it's not just the brands. The brands already have a great deal of pressure on them from their stakeholders and from us, from their customers. It's the myriad other players along the supply chain as well. Private and white label manufacturers are responsible for a huge amount of what we buy on the high street. These are the companies which produce clothing and accessories for another brand, and they put another brand's label into that product. Just one multinational, Li & Fung, supplies 40% of all of the clothes sold in the United States. But who's heard of them? There's very little public pressure on this sort of private and white label manufacturing company. Not one of these companies publishes any social or environmental responsibility report, nor do they publish any list of their suppliers nor their vendors. But back to the brands, there is a lot of pressure on the brands, and change is happening, and it's actually starting to happen pretty fast. Since publishing the Fashion Transparency Index back in April, we've seen Gap, Marks and Spencer's, and the VF Corporation, who owns North Face, Vans, Wrangler and others, publish a list of the factories where their clothes are stitched together. And Inditex, who owns Zara, Massimo Dutti and Pull&Bear, among other brands, has published a list of the facilities where the clothing is dyed, washed, printed, and where their leather is tanned. We've also seen Zara launch their first ever sustainable collection last month. I've been working on next year's edition of the Fashion Transparency Index, which will cover 100 of the world's leading brands. And I was surprised to discover that almost 25% of the brands have now published their first or their second tier factory lists. So why this shift? Some of it's undoubtedly down to new legislation and protection of brand reputation, but I believe we're seeing greater levels of disclosure, mainly because citizens around the world are starting to hold brands to account. Last month, the Business of Fashion published the 10 Commandments of New Consumerism, and coming in at number 1 was to provide transparency in your business practices. Transparency is now becoming more of an expectation than an option. Revealing information about business practices allows companies like Reformation, who we talked about earlier, to engage with companies in a new way. It allows them to open a dialogue and to create a more different, more honest brand experience. So there are plenty of smaller brands out there. This is a far cry from the traditional corporate conglomerates who have often kept things so closely under wraps. And likewise, the GlobeScan Corporate Responsibility Radar 2016 found that transparency is a critical driver of trust in business. Being seen as open and honest is the most significant driver of trust. Yet consumers across the world rate the performance of companies poorly for being open and honest. You can see here that it scores highest in terms of importance and lowest in terms of performance. Millennials want to know where their clothes come from. They want to know how the environment was affected in the process. And technology is increasingly giving them the tools to find out this information. companies are being held to a higher standard since the Rana Plaza disaster, and they're cognizant of this change. The Rana Plaza factory collapse in Bangladesh was inevitable. There are ever longer supply chains, and there's a resulting shift in responsibility. But this was a disaster which could have taken place really in any fast fashion producing country. Rana Plaza just happens to be in Bangladesh. What happens reflects a global trend of increased demand, which feeds the fast fashion supply chain. Since 1990, at least 2,200 garment workers had been killed in at least 300 separate safety accidents in Bangladesh, but calls for improvements had gone largely unheeded by the government and industry alike. Rana Plaza was originally built in 2006. It was planned and had permission to be a 6-storey building. It was poorly constructed and it was located on a drained swamp. The original building didn't actually have all of the proper permits. The 2 floors built later on were illegal, and a 9th floor was under construction at the time of the collapse. And all of this went either undetected or ignored by the Western companies who had repeatedly audited all of the factories which occupied that factory complex. And it took many brands after the disaster several weeks to work out what their relationship was with that factory complex. I'm sure a lot of people thought that the brands were just playing for time, but a lot of them really didn't know what their relationship was with the factories who were producing there. And campaigners had to search through the rubble to find the evidence of which labels were being produced there. Over the past 3 years, by asking brands the question, who made my clothes, Fashion Revolution has ignited a global conversation about supply chain transparency, and it's started to inspire people to think differently about what we wear. As citizens, we have a lot more power than we think. I remember after the first Fashion Revolution day, talking to an industry insider who said that the industry, the people he talked to, had been shocked by the level of people on social media who had asked the question, who made my clothes? And he said that for every one person that was asking the question, they would taking that as representing 10,000 people who thought the same but couldn't be bothered to do anything about it. So I think this shows the incredible power we have as consumers if we choose to do something about it. Our questions, our voices, our shopping habits have the power to continue to shift the dialogue within the fashion industry. An annual Fashion Revolution Day, which has now changed and grown into Fashion Revolution Week, is a way to keep the most vulnerable people in the supply chain in the public eye and hold the brands to account. Whilst much has been done by individual organisations over the years to bring about change, Fashion Revolution provides a platform for best practice initiatives across the supply chain. Everything from fair trade, which concentrates on the cotton farmer at the beginning of the supply chain, to those designers finding innovative ways to reduce waste. With a presence in over 90 countries, I think we're almost up to 100 countries now, Fashion Revolution is a growing global movement, advocating greater responsibility and social and environmental responsibility within the fashion supply chain. During Fashion Revolution Week this year, over 70,000 fashion lovers around the world asked brands, who made my clothes, with 156 million impressions of the hashtag. And we're seeing an increasing number of brands who are connecting with customers and their values through creating products which are more socially and environmentally transparent, telling stories about their makers and their materials. G-Star Raw, American Apparel, Marimekko, I visited their store in Finland when I was on the way to Singapore a couple of days ago. Fat Face, Boden, Massimo Dutti, Zara, Warehouse are among more than 1,200 fashion brands and retailers that responded with photographs of their workers saying, I made your clothes. A series of global events and online initiatives around the world encourage fashion lovers to be more curious about the clothes which they wear. Events took place in schools and universities around the world, and Fashion Revolution achieved an unbelievably large online media reach of 22 billion. The Rana Plaza garment factory collapse has produced a new generation of fashion revolutionaries. It's produced a generation of people like you who have been exposed to new and powerful stories about your clothes and are starting to ask new and powerful questions. Who made them? Where? What are their paying conditions like? What quality of life can a garment worker have? What are the environmental consequences of my clothing's manufacture? Could things be better? Are things better? What can we do if we don't like what we find? By asking the question, who made my clothes, we're applying pressure in the form of a perfectly reasonable question which brands should be able to answer. We're asking them to publicly acknowledge the people who make our clothes. Far too often brands' advertising and PR strategies still too rarely acknowledge the people that the clothes they sell have been made by people in hidden places, in homes, in factories, in small workshops, in fields around the world. Answering the question, who made my clothes, requires transparency, and this implies honesty, openness, communication and accountability. And this information also needs to be available to us, the public, in a way which starts to rebuild public trust in the fashion industry. Brands and retailers alike must start to take responsibility for the people and communities on which their businesses depend. And as I mentioned earlier, this isn't just the brands, but also all of those other stakeholders in the fashion supply chain. Tragedies like Rana Plaza are preventable, but they will continue to happen until all of these stakeholders are responsible for their actions and their impacts, until green really does become the new black. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that can green become the new black can be interpreted both with regard to the behaviour of brands and the mainstreaming of brand behaviour, but also the mainstreaming of consumer behaviour. Over the past 20 years, we've seen a growing disconnect between our purchasing of new clothes and our responsibility for their impact. Almost 3/4 of the world's clothing exports come from developing countries, meaning that the reality of their social and their environmental impact is removed. Fashion Revolution's mantra is be curious, find out, and do something about it. Unless we are curious and find out more about the impact of our rampant clothing consumption, we won't start to find out about the effects of pollution or waste from the textile industry. And it's certainly easier to ignore a problem if you can't see it, let alone breathe it or smell it or drink it. Which brings me on to the do something. What can all of us in this room do? I've already talked about what we can do in terms of putting pressure on the mainstream brands, looking at the brands we're wearing today, taking a picture of your label, asking who made my clothes. But also what can we do in terms of changing our consumption habits, of supporting sustainable new brands, of reducing our environmental impact. Vivienne Westwood says, buy less, choose well and make it last. So if we do this, what difference will it make? Well, it takes 2,720 litres of water to make one t-shirt, unless you're buying one of the t-shirts we heard about earlier, which takes only 1% of that, so I encourage you to buy one of those. Now, this is about as much water as you or I will drink over a 3-year period. According to Frances Corner in her excellent book, Why Fashion Matters, if we all extended the life cycle of our cotton garments by just 9 months, that would reduce the water footprint of our clothing by 30%. So there's a lot we can do in terms of caring for our products better. Alongside Fashion Revolution's call for transparency this year, we are also asking people to think differently about their relationship with their clothes and to do something about it by taking part in our Alternative campaign, which this year included high-profile vloggers like Madhu and Cutie Pie Marzia. Instead of the traditional fashion haul where you go shopping, you go to a cheap chain store and you make a YouTube video showing the bag full of clothing which you bought and all the ways you're going to buy your clothes, we asked people to try a Alternative. This is a way of refreshing your wardrobe without buying new clothes. Our alternatives included fashion fix. A rip, a missing button or a stain should never stand in the way of you and a good outfit. I've been doing a lot of this recently, especially with a new puppy who's often quite boisterous, and a lot of my clothes seem to have got little ladders in. So I've been trying some creative mending, and it's quite exciting to actually find out what colour threads you've got and how you can make something quite beautiful out of an ugly rip in a piece of clothing. So I'm getting quite good at that. So make your clothes last longer by repairing them when they need it. Get creative, mend your broken seams, your holes, your tears, and turn them into a fashion statement. Second hand, recreate your looks for a fat fraction of the price by going to local charity shops or thrift stores. Check out the stylist Emma Slade Edmondson, who recreates catwalk looks just moments after they appear on the London Fashion Week live stream. Her brand is called Back of the Wardrobe. She's a really great stylist, and every season you can see the looks which come down the catwalk, and she recreates looks supported by those designers which are almost indistinguishable, and I have to say quite often I prefer her version to the catwalk look. There's a Swishing event happening later on this afternoon, so do a clothes swap with a friend or host your own swishing party. You can even send clothes to somebody you don't know on the other side of the world. One of our alternatives last year was two high-profile bloggers, one in the UK and one in the US, who did a clothes swap and sent themselves each a bag of clothes and posted a video of their excitement at discovering this bag of new clothes for their wardrobe. DIY, if you've fallen out of love with a piece of clothing, don't throw it out, but change it up. You can tailor clothes to a different shape, you can add new embellishments or dye it a different colour. You could even turn it into something completely new. There's plenty of inspiration for this on YouTube and also in some of our previous alternatives as well. And you can vintage hunt for your own piece of history. As we heard, there's a great website here in Singapore where you can buy some vintage pieces. This year we also launched the Fashion Revolution Love Story. We love fashion, we love how clothes make us feel and how they represent how we feel about ourselves. Clothes are our message to the world about who we are. But we need to find new ways to wear the clothes we love without it costing the earth. In Singapore last year, 156,700 tonnes of textile and leather waste was generated, with only 8% of it being recycled. And in Britain, the average woman hoards £285 worth of clothes she will never wear in her wardrobe. That's the equivalent of 22 outfits, taking up valuable wardrobe space. And that's a lot of unloved clothing. So we need to buy less and we need to buy better. So join us in taking a stand against disposable fashion, impulse buys and fast fashion fixes. As well as committing to wear new items of clothing at least 30 times, we're asking people to fall back in love with the things they already own. The more we love our clothes, the more we care for them, the longer they will last. Share a story, make a video like this one which has just been posted on our website, or write a love letter about an item of clothing that means a lot to you. We reshape the fashion industry, the lives of its workers, its suppliers, its resources, every time we buy or dispose of an item of clothing. We reshape the fashion industry every time we find out stories about our clothes, talk about them with others, share these stories online, or ask a brand, who made my clothes? What we think, what we say and what we do changes fashion. We can all be fashion revolutionaries. And by doing this, we can all play our part and ensuring that green does become not just the new black, but also the new navy, emerald, lemon, fuchsia and polka dot, and not just as a surface print, but dyed through and through the fabric of fashion. Thank you.
My name is Andrew, and my question is, what is first-tier and second-tier suppliers in clothing industry? What does it mean?
The first-tier factories are traditionally known as cut-make trim. It's basically where your garment was stitched together. So, unfortunately, the label can tell you very little. If it says made in Italy, it could have been that the zip was put in and the label was put on in Italy. So you don't necessarily need to go by the label, but in theory the cut-make trim is where your clothes were sewn together, and then that's the first-tier factory, and then the second-tier factories are the subcontractors and where the cloth was made. And any other inputs which come into the garment as well. And then beyond that you get down to third tier, fourth tier, you get down to raw materials, you get down to the ginning and the spinning of the cotton and the yarns as well. Interestingly, Zara has published a lot of their second tier factories, but not their first tier factories, which is very curious. Usually people publish their first tier factories and then their second tier factories. I'm not quite sure why that is.
So the first tier is when they make the final arrangements to the...
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And why do the company do not want to reveal this information?
Well, traditionally a lot of the companies don't even know that information. It's not always that they don't want to reveal that information. I mean, obviously now there's a lot of pressure on companies, and with government legislation coming into play, like the modern slavery bill, brands have to report on everything they're doing throughout their supply chains. They have to know where their clothing was produced. But the industry has become so opaque. So many people work through agents. I mean, one big global fashion brand, somebody told me recently, they still don't know where anything comes from. They couldn't report where a single item of their clothing is actually made. And, you know, we find that astonishing to think that the clothes we're wearing, you know, you would imagine that the brand knew at least that first level factory where it was stitched together. But that's not necessarily the case because of the structure of the supply chain now.
And you mentioned this like slave labor. How does it look like? What I can imagine under this term?
A lot of the time slave labour can look very much like conventional labour. That's why it's so hard to spot. I mean, it was Anti-Slavery Day earlier on this week, and I was hearing from the UK's Modern Slavery Commissioner that a lot of the time, you know, it's very difficult to tell the difference between somebody who is working for slave labour as slave labour and somebody who's working normally. You know, it could be that their passport's been taken away. They might be getting some money, but often they will be getting no remuneration. But visibly, you don't always know whether it's slave labour. So that's why the onus really has to be on the brands to report what they're doing to address it. Because as a consumer, you know, sometimes the worst instances of slave labour, yes, of course, it's really obvious. And it's not just overseas as well. Like Baroness Udine in the UK said she's been to garment factories in the East End of London, which was bad as anything she's seen in Bangladesh. People locked in rooms, no identity documentation, children in there. They don't have any rights. They're not getting a minimum wage. So don't think this is just overseas and just in developing countries. It can be happening on our doorstep. It's certainly happening in the UK, in London, in Leicester as well.
So basically they are getting paid, but they are maybe getting paid not so much, and their working conditions are not so great or are very bad, yeah? That's like the slave labor.
They might not necessarily be getting paid. Some might be getting something. I mean, slave labour means that they are in slave labour or bonded labour, that they can't escape from their employment as well, that they are also under some kind of contract of obligation to their employer.
Thank you very much.
There's a lot of different aspects to slave labour.
I have a personal question. What was it like for you? Like, fashion revolution blew up, you know, like to be suddenly thrown onto the global stage and to be a spokesperson. Like, what was that like, that roller coaster over the last couple of years, like for you personally?
Yes. Well, I mean, I guess sort of quite scaring, but at the same time something which I just had to run with because it was my crazy idea in the bath about 3 days after the Rana Plaza disaster. I mean, Fashion Revolution literally just hit me in the head in the bathtub, and it seemed like a good enough idea as a typical entrepreneur to get out of the bath and to do something about it. So I got out of my warm Sunday night bath and called Ursula de Castro, who seemed the most obvious person to talk to. I didn't know her that well at the time, but she was as well known on the environmental side as I was known on the social side. The next day Lucy Seaver called, who's a well-known ethical journalist as well. And so I really felt from the outset, you know, this is my crazy idea, I've got to run with it. So, you know, within 9 months I'd given up Pachacuti, the brand I'd grown over the last 23 years, and said to my husband, look, you've got to run it now, I'm sorry, I'm out of here. And, you know, give him all his credit, he's been doing that, and I run in for a couple of hours a week to make sure everything's running, a couple of hours a month actually, to make sure everything's still running smoothly, and that's about all I do there. So yeah, I had to run with it. I hated public speaking, absolutely terrified me. It's the kind of thing where, you know, with practice you do start to improve, and, you know, I've had to do a lot of dealing with the press, television interviews where you literally have 3 minutes to get your message across, even when the presenter wants to get you off onto a completely different track. So it's been a learning curve. You know, I've got so much research to do, still so much to learn, because there's just so many aspects. The industry is so multifaceted, and there's still so much to learn, and so much is changing every day as well.
Hi, Carrie. I just want to say you're really an amazing inspiration. I've been following the Fashion Revolution very, very closely, all of the work that you've been doing with Ursula, also with public personalities like Livia Firth, etc. But quickly, obviously, what you're doing is amazing, and the fact that it's blown up to the scale that it has is incredible, and it's really, for the large part, in the Western world. But as we're seeing in a lot of developing countries, particularly countries like China, who are becoming the biggest consumers in the world, and actually there's a lot of questions as to where is all of that coming from, especially with e-commerce coming in, and platforms like Taobao, where literally there's products where you can buy leather boots for like £40. And so where does your education pipeline go? I mean, this is for the Western world, but when we have such a big demographic, such a big area of the world who are actually going to be propelling the fast fashion movement even further forward, do you have a vision to take it to other languages, to other regions, to educate beyond just where we are?
Yes, I mean, Fashion Revolution's actually in, I don't know what it is now, so 96, 97 countries. We're really strong in Latin America. I think almost every country in Latin and Central America has a really strong Fashion Revolution team. I've just been out in Mexico. I've met earlier this year a lot of the teams in Central and South America. We have really strong teams in places like Bangladesh and India, working both with the garment factories there and with the consumers, because we recognise, you know, that's where the change has to happen. We really need to get a strong team in China. We have a team in Hong Kong, but not yet in China, so that's certainly somewhere where we do need to get a Fashion Revolution set up. But I think in a lot of developing countries we do have strong teams, but they also all deal with their own issues. So for instance, for our teams in Africa, the main issue they're facing is the dumping of our second-hand clothing on their country, and the way in which this is destroying all of the textile and tailoring trades. And of course, you know, hopefully this is going to change, possibly with the potential ban on second-hand clothing coming in 2019 in countries like Tanzania. But is this happening too late? Can the garment industries in those countries be revived? So I think in every country it's going to have, you know, its own tone, its own nuances, and its own emphasis. But, you know, we're certainly very much working with consumers in developing countries as much as developed countries.
Okay, wonderful. And on that note, can we please give Carrie Summers a big round of applause?